So I'm here today with Matthew Teutsch, the director of the Lillian E. Smith Center here at Piedmont College. Thank you so much for being with me here today.
Thank you for having me.
So the way I met you, obviously, was through Twitter. You had read Masterless Man, my first book, and started sending me little pieces from American literature, specifically from Frank Yerby, who we'll get into in a little bit. But you know, as the years went along, and your last year as a Fulbrighter in Norway, which we'll also get into, you started sending me some things from Lillian Smith, and she quickly became one of my favorite people in Southern history. And she's somebody that, even growing up in the South, I knew nothing about until you started sending me her writings. So can you tell me a little bit about her background, what she came from, and kind of how she got involved in writing and activism?
So Lillian Smith was born in Jasper, Florida, 1897, from a large family. Her dad owned a mill, employed black and white workers at the mill. After World War I, the mill kind of went bust, so they lost their money and then moved up to Clayton, Georgia, which is where they had a summer house. A few years after that, they started a summer camp for girls, and her father and mother ran it. And if you look around the library here, you'll see actually books about camp. So they read up everything they could about camp and child psychology and teaching children. So they started that. She worked a couple of different jobs. She went to Piedmont for a year, and then actually went to the Peabody Conservatory for 1 or 2 years to actually study piano. Found out that wasn't for her. She wouldn't be a great pianist, more of an accompanist. So her brother went to China and was there, and she followed her brother there and worked there, basically at the YMCA or the YWCA. In ministry stuff, basically, and teaching piano and music, and she was in China for 3 years. That time in China, I think, opened her eyes to a lot of things, and if you look at kind of what she wrote about that it opened the world to her. Seeing the way that the British treated the Chinese, the segregation, the way they kept them out of their own gardens, their own land, the way they suppressed them, reminded her of the South and Jim Crow and segregation.
Right.
So she noticed that, and then her parents started getting sick. They contacted her to come home and to take over the camp. She took over the camp basically, I believe, about 27 years of age. And Laurel Falls Camp, she ran it from then till 1948 when it closed, about 4 years after Strange Fruit, her first novel, was published. So she was up here teaching young girls, middle-class white girls specifically. They talked about everything up here, from race, psychology. They did sculpture, they did art, they talked about sex and masturbation. They talked about everything.
Right.
So 1930s, 1940s Georgia, talking about these things on the mountain.
Right.
It wasn't interracial, it wasn't mixed, but she did have black children and other children come up and play with the campers. And these were white middle-class girls who were up here from Atlanta and from around Alabama, Georgia, Florida, even had some from New York.
Even Jewish girls, well. Right.
There's a scrapbook in the archives at Piedmont of one of the Jewish campers and everything that she did that year, I think 44 and 45. Wow. So about when the war ended. She published her first novel, during that time too, her and Paula Snelling, who was her partner, actually started a literary magazine. It started off with one name and eventually ended up with South Today. Published it from about the mid-30s to probably about the mid-40s. I believe, if the numbers are correct, about a 10,000 circulation.
Which we have to think about during those war years,
right.
How few people continued their publications or subscriptions.
It's the Great Depression.
Right. Nobody's buying print.
So what's amazing, if you look at those two, she has Walter White. She has paintings by Jacob Lawrence. She has Pauli Murray in there. She has W.J. Cash in there. She has countless people in there. A scathing review of Gone with the Wind. I mean, there's tons of stuff. A bunch of satire about Eugene Talmadge. They're ripping Talmadge. And they have this huge kind of cachet, at least within this. And they're doing all this from this mountain, from this spot in northeast Georgia.
Literally this spot right here that we're sitting in, which is beautiful, incredible. the walls are completely lined with her books that after this interview, I'm going to take my time and go through and look. But as you said, she knew all of the key players who were trying to advance civil rights throughout the South. And her writings, if you read them today, they're still so pertinent. And where do you think she got that sense of social justice, that sense of as a white person in the South, especially in the 30s and 40s, what made her want to, really talk about race and tackle issues of race?
I think one, her father, who told her basically, if you see something wrong, do something about it. Mm-hmm. If you don't do anything, it's worse than a sin. I think her trip to China opened her eyes. Traveling, whether you actually physically travel somewhere, or if you travel she has a quote in The Journey, which is basically her, after she learned she had cancer, her kind of journeying through her life and figuring out about her humanity and who she is. She has a comment in there about whether you journey across the world or across Main Street. Mm-hmm. But reaching out and connecting with people, because there are people who tell me that they've lived in Rabun County or Clayton and never knew she was here, right. Never knew anything about this space. So not learning about that. I think travel opened up her eyes. I think specifically she points to China, and like I said, what she saw there. But then I think what gets really interesting, if you look at her too, she basically points out that you need to look at yourself and figure out yourself too. She's very critical about whites looking at their actual privilege. She uses the terms white privilege and white supremacy and all these terms that we see today in the 30s and the 40s, and she's saying all this. So I think it's a multitude of things that kind of open up her mind. Psychology, with Freud and Jung and all of them too. I think it's a myriad of factors.
I mean, and so much of what she went through, I think a lot of white Southerners today, the ones of us who have come around to be real progressives, especially racial progressives, have experienced things like she has, and especially travel. I know my year in Ireland, living in a socialist democratic country, was very transformative in the way that I viewed things, from healthcare to systemic racism. Now, you just completed your first year, your year abroad in Norway as a Fulbrighter.
Another social democratic.
Yes. And what do you think that year abroad gave you insight into how she must have felt those few years in China?
I don't know about insight into how she felt in China. I think what stuck out to me is you have these views of Norway. I mean, they give the Nobel Peace Prize. You have these views of socially democratic, egalitarian, everything's equal, everybody's equal. But then when you get there and kind of learn things, especially after the Syrian refugee migration into Europe, the ways that Norway kind of closed off their borders, they built a wall between Russia and Norway to keep migrants out, basically, or refugees out. The Islamophobia there was an attempted mass shooting at a mosque like a couple of months ago that one of the worshipers actually thwarted. Nothing happened. So all these things, and the things being spouted from the government too. So to learn that these issues, which I knew, that the issues that we face here are not just here; they're international as well. And what's fascinating about Smith too is she notices those too, and she points that out. She uses the South as a locus, but she points out globally. She's looking at colonialism and some of her later stuff. She's looking at the North and the West. She's looking elsewhere. She's not just looking here, but she's using here as the focus.
And how much do you think that changed in class for her when she grew up pretty wealthy? As you said, her father owned a mill. It was a lumber mill, I think, if I'm not mistaken. And then they lost everything. And that change in having so much and probably being, relatively well educated because you came from that class status and then enter back into poverty. What do you think that did for her? Yeah.
That's a good question. I mean, I did read an article about the way she viewed mountain folk, Appalachian, poor whites specifically, and it seems like she kind of looked down on them, possibly, and then her attitudes kind of changed. But I don't necessarily know. But they were well off, they were educated, they had means, and then of course they lost everything. So that's something that I need to dig into more, but I think that's something that's interesting to look at.
Now, one of the things I find fascinating about her is the fact that she was, in all probability, a lesbian. And that's something that we don't openly talk about for a lot of people throughout Southern history, even though, as we know, that Southern gays, lesbian, bisexuals, even transgender people lived very openly, and it wasn't something that was necessarily flaunted or put out really ostentatiously, but it was known in the community. People knew that, they just didn't talk about it. This hasn't really been written about for her specifically yet. There's been hints at it. What do you think you taking over the center might do for her connection to LGBTQI rights, progressivism at large?
That's an interesting question too. I think that knowing that she was here, that she had a partner, Paula Snelling, who was very much involved in the production of what she was doing too. That connected relationship, I think, will do a lot to know that people aren't alone or weren't alone actually now too. I mean, opening up that conversation with her is important. And I think there have been some things done about that, but like I was telling you, even like 93, there was an article or a book chapter I read, and I was like, well, she may have been, may not have been, so it wasn't necessarily clear. I believe a lot of the letters that she wrote to Paula were burned. So there's even that aspect of what was there, what wasn't.
Do you think they were burned by Paula, who outlived her by a couple of decades?
I don't remember. That's being new, that there's still some things I'm still trying to learn and piece together. So that's something I haven't dove into too much yet. But it's something that needs to be looked at.
And it was interesting because...
especially in Strange Fruit, too. In Strange Fruit, one of the characters actually has... I mean, her mother finds a sculpture... her mother finds a sculpture in the daughter's room of a naked woman, basically. And there's these hints of her lesbianism, and her mother destroys it. So these things are running through her first novel, too. And they're things that are brought out, I think, in some scholarship need to be brought out more, too.
And I think it absolutely will, because we're seeing this happen within the Black intellectual culture. You mentioned that she was very good friends with Pauli Murray, and I recently just read a headline, I've got it saved to read the actual article, that Pauli Murray was probably either gay or transgender. And it makes you wonder what kind of group they had here in the Deep South, of activists and writers that were all gay, and maybe it was completely interracial, but they must have had a really vibrant community.
Yeah, which I think is something, like you mentioned earlier, that needs to be looked at more. I don't know where to start with that. I'm sure people do, and they need to start looking at that.
What do you think Lillian Smith's importance is in Georgia history and in Appalachian history, and why is she important that we're looking at her now, today?
In Georgia history, Appalachian history, okay. I have to admit I don't know much about Appalachia yet.
No worries.
Coming from Louisiana, and it's a different kind of geographical regional makeup. The Georgia history I'm learning more and more about too, moving to Georgia, and knowing the Deep South and Alabama and Louisiana and Mississippi, and knowing what went on there, learning more about Jim Crow and segregation here and what was happening here with Eugene Talmadge, like I said, piece of work if you've read his stuff, or any kind of things about him. But learning what she was up against here in Georgia, I think and she was very vocal. I mean, she kept talking about Talmadge and basically being like these demagogues spouting fear and spouting these things, and then we need to fight them back. Don't be swept in by the fear. So I think learning that is important. Learning that there were voices fighting back against that is important. One of the Lillian Smith Book Award winners this year was, I don't remember her name, but The Life of Horace Tate, who helped with desegregation and education. Then that's another voice that needs to be read. I want to read that book. I think of her within my own journey in the South. Being a Southerner, being from Louisiana, spending my whole life in the South except for last year in Norway. Being in Alabama, being here, and the way that as a white Southerner she critiqued herself and her own prejudices and what came with those prejudices. I think that's what's important, and not just for the South or for Georgia or for Appalachia, but for, like I said, Norway, everybody. Right. She's doing things that authors today are doing, and she's doing it really early.
She's doing it during one of the bloodiest times in Georgia's history. I mean, in the 30s, especially 20s, 30s, you've just got lynchings all over the state, just absolute.
And they talked about that stuff up here. So the other day I was reading one of the letters. She wrote letters to campers' parents. There was a letter from 1946 that she wrote to the campers' parents. She starts the letter off. She's talking about the plays they're putting on, all the productions they're doing, all these things. It's a 2-page letter on legal paper. At the end, there's 3 paragraphs. In those paragraphs, she says there was a lynching, a mass murder in Monroe, Georgia. The kids are asking about it. What do we do about it? The kids are asking, how are the mothers feeling? How are their children feeling? I mean, did these mothers, because it was 2 married couples who were lynched in 46, the last mass lynching, if you look it up in Monroe, Georgia. But they were asking, did these mothers have kids? How are the kids feeling? How are they doing? They were thinking about that.
There was empathy there. It wasn't a complete racist culture. There was empathy for the human element.
And these are children who were asking these questions. I mean, if you read To Kill a Mockingbird, that's what Scout's doing. And the way that education goes, and the way that people talk about it, and push those children, is what leads to these other things. Because it reminds me too of the there's a famous picture that, I don't know if you've seen it, I know I shared it on Twitter, but a little, probably 2 or 3-year-old kid in the Ku Klux Klan outfit. He's standing in front of a black policeman who has riot gear on, or has a riot shield in front of him, and the kid's like pointing his finger out at the riot shield, basically, and the black policeman's looking down at him. So he's looking at himself in the mirror. That was taken in Gainesville. That's an hour from here?
Right.
Back in 1992. So how do kids deal with, and she was very interested in that. She points out again and again, I want black children, and especially white children, to, be educated and have a reckoning with their past in the midst of their past. And she's very much engaged in that. And I think that's why this camp, I think, was important.
Right, and I think that's why it's so important today for the white people in this, not just this state, not just this region, but in all of America, to really realize the work that we have to do to retrain our own children, our own generation. And I think in thinking about how she laid it out, it came at people with love, and it came at people with empathy and understanding, and in training these children, what it really made me think about was the UDC, the Daughters of the Confederacy, right, who are at the same time launching this campaign to teach white children about, the honors of the Confederacy, and kind of whitewash our past racially, and our history with slavery, and talk about how wonderful, the antebellum South was, plantation slavery, and create this kind of moonlights and magnolias image of the South and of being white in the South. And she's actually doing the complete opposite. Right,
which wasn't just a UDC thing too, like there's a video that Hal Jacobs uses in the documentary, Lillian Smith Breaking the Silence. It's the plantation tradition in the Old South, or in the South. It's from 1950. And if you look at that video, it's like a 10-minute video you can look on YouTube. It's basically a glamorization of the plantation. It talks about slavery as a class system. There were different classes of people. It talks about the genteel manners, all these things. Talks about the fine, lavish furniture brought in from Europe, and all of these things into the houses. And it's very telling of the time, too, when she's writing against that. She never mentions the plantation or things like that, but that's what she's writing against.
And it's interesting in Appalachia from a class perspective, because people do tend to associate Appalachia with poor whites, with working class whites. And so to have that juxtaposition against the cotton plantation South, I think is really, really interesting.
And it's like the discussion, what was it in the Midwest with the representatives saying that the guy from the New York Times said that, well, they shouldn't represent the Midwest because they're black, basically, or colored. They're colored representatives. But people say the same thing about Appalachia, too. It's not just whites who live here. It's multiple ethnic backgrounds who live here.
As so many great writers and historians are pointing out now, from Jesse Wilkerson to Elizabeth Catt, busting the J.D. Vance myth about what this region is about and who it's made of.
Artist Project.
Right, exactly. Shout out to Adam McNeil, who I'm sure will be interviewing you soon about your Frank Yerby book. So congratulations on that. It will be out 2020.